You're watching Light Behind Bars, where real crime meets powerful redemption. Every story here is inspired by true events brought to life through deep emotion and fiction. If you're ready to explore the human side of justice, don't forget to subscribe and turn on the bell, because some stories deserve to be heard, not forgotten. Before the darkness named Israel, Keyes consumed lives and sowed invisible terror. Before his name spread through newsreels like a cursed whisper, there was only a boy with watchful eyes, quiet as a frozen lake in winter, hidden among the ancient forests of the Pacific Northwest. His name was Israel, a name heavy with the echoes of ancient teachings, of an unyielding faith his parents sought to etch into his tender soul. As if carving words onto a tombstone, their home, if it could be called that, was often a ramshackle wooden cabin, standing alone in the wild, where the light of civilization's electricity never reached, where the convenience of running water was a distant dream. Only the flickering dance of candlelight illuminated rough-hewn wooden walls at night, while the wind howled through the cracks, carrying the icy breath of the wilderness. By day, sunlight pierced the dense canopy, casting dappled patterns on the damp earth, like the probing fingers of some unseen entity. Israel grew up in this isolation, not the romantic solitude of those who seek nature's embrace, but an enforced seclusion, an invisible wall separating him from the outside world, from children his age, from the carefree laughter and games of youth. His parents, driven by an extremist faith and a constant fear of a world they deemed corrupt, built their own isolated sanctuary. They homeschooled their children, imparting lessons steeped in rigid dogma, apocalyptic prophecies, and the need to purify oneself from the temptations of the outside. Israel's world shrank to the worn pages of ancient scriptures, tales of punishment and salvation, and the vast forests where he could wander for hours without encountering another soul. The forest became his friend, his teacher, and perhaps his first accomplice. In the near absolute silence of the green wilderness, Israel learned to observe. He watched predators stalk their prey, striking with precision and ruthlessness. He saw trees felled by storms, a deathly stillness settling over the aftermath. There was no sentimentality, no mercy in that natural world, only the raw law of survival. And perhaps he saw a reflection of himself in that cold indifference. His already quiet eyes grew deeper, more inscrutable. They held no trace of the fear or curiosity typical of childhood, but rather a strange focus, a chilling analytical clarity far beyond his years. As the family moved from place to place, like ghosts unable to find rest, Israel's sense of detachment only grew. Each new home was a fresh start in an unfamiliar world, without friends or roots. He learned to adapt quickly, blending into new environments like a chameleon, leaving no trace, drawing no attention. His existence was so quiet it was almost invisible, even within his own family. Among his siblings, Israel seemed to inhabit a private world, an inner sanctum no one could breach. There were signs, subtle and fleeting, like ripples on a lake before a storm, a lack of emotion where feelings should have stirred, a strange delight in watching small creatures suffer, a knack for lying without hesitation or shame, but in an environment where difference was a threat and obedience was paramount. These signs were easily overlooked or attributed to other causes. They were merely seeds, sown in a soul already hardened by a lack of genuine love and connection, quietly waiting for the darkness to grow thick enough for them to sprout. The teachings of sin and punishment echoed in the boy's mind, but instead of instilling divine fear, they seemed to spark a perverse curiosity. If the world was rife with sin, and humanity was inherently weak, where did the line between good and evil truly lie, and who had the right to judge? These questions went unspoken, swirling in the young but already weathered mind of Israel, like venomous snakes seeking a way out. He observed the adults around him, preaching faith and purity while living in fear and suspicion. He saw their contradictions, their hypocrisy, and a faint sense of contempt began to take shape. Outwardly, Israel remained a quiet, obedient boy, but inwardly, a different world was forming, a world with no room for weakness, no place for tears, a world built on cold observation, meticulous calculation, and a vague, unformed hunger for control. The seed of darkness had been planted. The ancient forest bore witness, and the silence of long, lonely nights nurtured it, waiting for the moment it would rise, casting its cold, deadly shadow over everything. The boy, named Israel, bearer of a name tied to hope and faith, was unknowingly stepping toward the opposite, toward an abyss he would later deepen with the blood and tears of innocent victims. Faith, in the formative years of Israel Keyes, was not a refreshing stream nourishing his soul, but a heavy stone, pressing down on his frail shoulders. It was a system of rigid rules, stern prohibitions, and a portrait of God as a severe judge rather than a loving father. Endless prayer sessions, sermons about the torments of hell, and tales of humanity's fall, these drilled fear and guilt deep into his core. Love, forgiveness, the gentler facets of faith, if mentioned at all, were faint and distant, like cold moonlight unable to warm the night. Young Israel, with his sharp intellect and keen observational skills, began to notice cracks in what seemed an impregnable fortress of faith. He saw the contradictions between the words and actions of the self-proclaimed devout. He heard fervent prayers for salvation, but witnessed resentful glares and harsh judgments aimed at those who didn't share their beliefs or were simply different. The outside world he was taught to fear and shun sometimes revealed glimpses of humanity, genuine smiles that he rarely found in his isolated community. Doubt, at first a mere grain of sand, grew into a boulder in his heart, questions he dared not voice. Uncertainties no one could satisfactorily answer, smoldered quietly. Why would an all-powerful, benevolent God create a world rife with suffering? Why were those who claimed to be his followers so cruel and narrow-minded? The biblical stories, held as absolute truth, began to appear in a new light, tales of violence, vengeance, and an unforgiving, imposed authority. There was no dramatic aha moment marking the collapse of Israel's faith. It was a gradual erosion, like water wearing down stone, like roots rotting from within. Each lie he uncovered, each act of hypocrisy he observed, each unanswered question chipped away at the foundation of that faith. One day, he looked back and realized the once solid structure was nothing but a hollow shell. The echoes of hymns and prayers lingered, but they were empty sounds, reverberating in a space stripped of sacred meaning. When faith crumbled, it didn't leave behind a clean void, a fertile soul awaiting better seeds. No, it left a desolate wasteland, a dead land where old values were ruthlessly uprooted, but nothing new or positive was built in their place. Instead, that void was swiftly invaded by something colder, more cynical. If there was no God, no heaven or hell, what stopped a person from doing whatever they desired? If moral rules were merely man-made constraints, why obey them? The loss of faith didn't bring Israel freedom or liberation. Instead, it deepened his already darkening view of human nature. The world, in his eyes, became a chaotic place, devoid of divine order or higher purpose. It was filled with selfish individuals scrambling for power and resources, cloaking their true nature in hypocritical moral facades. And Israel Keyes resolved not to be a naive sheep among wolves. He would be a wolf cunning, dangerous, and unmatched. This spiritual emptiness became fertile ground for the dark seeds planted in childhood to flourish. The absence of belief in a higher power or cosmic moral order removed the final barriers restraining his darkest impulses. No fear of divine punishment, no guilt before a higher being. Only cold calculations of earthly costs and consequences remained. And Israel, with his sharp mind, soon realized that with enough cunning and caution, those consequences could be evaded. He didn't openly reject religion that would draw unwanted attention. Outwardly, he could still play the part of a normal, even compliant person, but inwardly, a deep contempt for all forms of faith and moral systems took root. He saw the devout as weak, easily manipulated. He viewed societal rules as games that the clever could circumvent. The barren land of Israel's soul was no longer a quiet place. It became a furnace, forging silent rage, disdain, and a perverse thirst for control. If there was no God to worship, he would become his own God, wielding the power to decide life and death. dispensing pain and destruction at will. The collapse of faith didn't free him. It opened a gate to hell within his soul, where demons of cruelty and indifference began to dance freely. The light of faith had gone out, leaving only thick darkness. And in that darkness, a monster was slowly taking shape, ready to unleash terror on a world he had long despised and grown weary of. The echoes of old prayers were drowned out by the growl of primal instinct, a promise of the atrocities yet to come. The abyss toward which Israel Keyes was slowly descending didn't open with a thunderous roar. It was like a small crack in parched earth. At first, just wide enough for an ant to slip through. Then gradually, silently widening with each rain, each gust of wind, until it could swallow a life whole. His first step into that abyss wasn't a reckless leap, but a deliberate probe, a calculated experiment by a mind that had already mastered concealing its darkest intentions. With the bonds of faith and traditional morality crumbling to ash in his soul, a new sensation crept in. It wasn't serene freedom, but a subtle urge, a craving to test limits, to cross boundaries society had drawn. If nothing was sacred, nothing absolutely forbidden, why not explore where the true limits lay? The emptiness within him screamed to be filled, and the ordinary joys of everyday life, mundane pleasures, couldn't soothe it. Israel's first act of crime, though likely unrecorded in any official ledger at the time, held profound significance in his dark journey. It wasn't a petty theft born of need, nor a reckless outburst of youthful rebellion. It was a deliberate violation, planned with chilling precision and executed with cold calm. Perhaps it was an empty house, one he had meticulously observed, memorizing the rhythms of its occupants' lives, their absences. The darkness of night, once a childhood fear, now became an ally, a perfect veil for his sinister intentions. The sensation of breaching a physical barrier, a pried-open door, a broken window lock mirrored the crossing of a psychological one. The thrill, a mix of fear of discovery and a perverse delight in violating another's private sanctuary, was a potent drug inside the house, in the oppressive silence. Every small sound, the creak of a floorboard, the whistle of wind through a gap made his heart race. But it wasn't paralyzing fear. It was heightened alertness, absolute focus on the task. Israel didn't rummage chaotically for valuables. His movements were methodical, almost ritualistic. What he sought wasn't just material. It was the feeling of control, the power of moving freely in another's space, touching their possessions, defiling their privacy. It was an affirmation that he could break rules, defy societal order, and get away with it. Each item taken wasn't just of material value, it was a trophy, proof of his cunning and capability. As he slipped away from the scene, taking his spoils and leaving no significant trace, a small flame ignited in Israel's icy soul. It wasn't a fire of remorse or guilt. It was the flame of exhilaration, of a dark empowerment, the rush of success, of outsmarting others, of deceiving an entire system, was intoxicating. It was a toxic whisper that he was smarter, different, above society's petty rules. That first step didn't bring lasting satisfaction. The small flame demanded more fuel to burn, but it proved something crucial. He could do it. He could plan, execute, and evade punishment. The abyss now seemed less daunting, even alluring in its sinister pull. Each small success in breaking rules bolstered his confidence in his abilities and his contempt for the world around him. This wasn't yet blood. It wasn't yet screams of terror. It was only violated silence, tainted privacy, and a newfound sense of power. But the crack had widened. The shadow within Israel had tasted the sweetness of transgression and began to crave more. The silence of the nights that followed was no longer empty. It brimmed with new plans, bolder ideas, more cunning ways to test boundaries. The boy who once watched predators stalk in the forest had now become a predator himself. Though his initial prey was only property, the security of others, yet the essence of his actions was the same: stalking, calculating, seizing. The outside world, with its rules and laws, became a vast playground where Israel could test his skills, honing his cunning, and no one suspected. Outwardly, he remained a quiet young man, perhaps a bit aloof, but unremarkable. The mask was crafted to perfection. That first step into the abyss, however small it seemed, set the course for all that followed. The downward path was no longer a vague possibility, but a choice made. The small flame of transgression, fueled by power and contempt, would soon erupt into a raging inferno, consuming the last remnants of conscience and compassion, paving the way for crimes far more horrific, for deeper shadows that Israel Keyes would soon unleash upon the world. The small flame sparked by Israel Keyes' first crime didn't fade. Instead, it hungered to be fed, to blaze brighter, having tasted the perverse sweetness of transgression and power. Keyes could no longer return to the bland normalcy of his former life. The emptiness in his soul now had a purpose, a means to temporarily soothe its conquest, control, and the assertion of his superiority by shattering the rules others were bound to follow. His subsequent steps into the abyss grew bolder, more sophisticated. What began as the random selection of an easy target evolved into a calculated art. Keyes no longer impulsively broke into empty homes. He began to invest time in observation, gathering intelligence, studying the habits of potential prey, though, at this stage. Prey might still have been mere property, a family's sense of security, or the peace of a small business. He learned to read his surroundings, spotting weaknesses in security systems and moments of human carelessness. The methods of a predator emerged, not through bloody violence, but through terrifyingly meticulous preparation. Each theft, each violation, was planned like a small military campaign. He could spend weeks, even months, stalking a target, memorizing schedules, identifying vulnerabilities. He prepared specialized kits, not just crowbars or bolt cutters, but tools to erase traces, avoid detection, and ensure a clean escape. Control became an obsession, control over the scene, the information, and his own emotions. He acted not with anger or hatred, but with cold, almost mechanical efficiency. The vast country, with its bustling cities and remote rural stretches, unwittingly became his hunting ground. His work as a construction contractor, requiring travel, provided the perfect cover and opportunities to scout new hunting grounds. Each business trip doubled as reconnaissance, a chance to identify potential targets and plan future crimes. He learned to blend into different environments, becoming invisible in crowds, a forgettable face, a shadow passing without leaving a mark. The escalation wasn't just in the frequency or scale of his acts, but in the risks he was willing to take. What started with empty homes progressed to small businesses at night. Then came greater audacity, perhaps a break-in while occupants slept soundly, or a plan requiring split-second timing to avoid detection. Each success, each narrow escape, reinforced his illusion of invincibility and deepened his contempt for law enforcement's capabilities. Keyes' so-called loss of control wasn't chaotic action. On the contrary, he grew more methodical, more disciplined in his crimes. The true loss of control was deeper an addiction to the act itself, the rush of power, the thrill of outsmarting others. The satisfaction of success became a drug he couldn't quit. The gaps between his jobs grew unbearable, filled with restlessness, a gnawing urge pushing him to plan the next act. Crime was no longer a choice. It was a need, an integral part of his warped existence. Within, the darkness grew denser, swallowing the last vestiges of empathy or conscience. He viewed the world through a predator's lens, dividing people into two categories, those like him, the strong and the weak sheep, waiting to be exploited or destroyed. Indifference became his shield, guarding against emotions that might weaken his resolve. He felt no guilt, no remorse, only cold satisfaction when a plan succeeded and fleeting irritation when something went awry. Outwardly, Keyes maintained a facade of normalcy. He could be the quiet neighbor, the diligent co-worker, even the seemingly devoted father. His mask, honed to perfection, had no cracks. He mastered compartmentalization, separating his dark underworld from his daily life with extraordinary mental discipline, which only fueled his arrogance. He was a man of two faces, and he reveled in that duality. This escalation was a slippery slope. Each step downward made stopping harder. The abyss loomed closer, its pull growing stronger. The predator's methods were refined, his confidence bolstered, and his hunger for crime became uncontrollable. Keyes stood on the brink of a final transformation, from a sophisticated thief and trespasser to something far darker, something even the most horrific nightmares could scarcely conjure. His hunting ground was ready. And he, the monster in human guise, was nearly prepared to unleash true terror, the line between violating property and violating life. For a soul as utterly corroded as Israel Keyes was as fragile as a spider's thread. It wasn't a sturdy moral wall, but merely the next logical step in the escalation of his darkness. The final assertion of the absolute power he craved. The thrill of breaking in, of controlling another's space, no longer sufficed to feed his growing addiction. A darker, more primal urge stirred within, demanding the ultimate transgression, the taking of a life. Israel Keyes' first murder was not a spontaneous act of rage or the result of a botched theft. Like everything he did, it was deliberate, if not meticulously planned down to the victim's identity, then at least prepared with a psychological and methodological readiness. He had envisioned it, rehearsed it in his mind, stripped away any disgust or hesitation. To him, it wasn't about killing a person, but eliminating an object, executing the ultimate act of control. Perhaps it was a cold night, with snow falling lightly, blanketing the world in a thin layer of white, muting its sounds, a near-perfect stillness, mirroring the icy calm of Keyes' soul. The victim might have been a stranger, chosen randomly for their vulnerability, their isolation, or simply for being in the wrong place at the wrong time. This randomness was, for Keyes, part of the control. He held the power to decide who lived or died, without reason, without personal motive, simply because he could. When he approached the victim, perhaps with a carefully crafted lie or a cleverly set trap, there was no trembling, no hesitation. His deep, emotionless eyes locked onto the victim, not as a human, but as an object about to be destroyed. Their fear, panic, or pleas if any failed to touch him. They were merely sounds, predictable reactions, incapable of swaying the cold resolve of a killer. The act of taking a life was carried out with brutal precision, an efficiency honed through prior experiments, even if only in his imagination or with non-human targets. It might have been a sudden strangulation, a fatal knife strike, or another method chosen for its effectiveness and control. There was no outward sadistic glee, no savage grin, only intense focus, like a surgeon performing a complex operation. Except the purpose here was destruction, not healing. Blood. For the first time, human blood spilled by his hand, the deep red stark against the white snow. An image seared into his retina, not with horror, but with a strange sense of completion. The first life had been taken. The final line had been crossed. There was no turning back. He had become a murderer. After the act, silence returned, heavier, more haunting, but it wasn't the weight of guilt or remorse. It was the silence of a predator, sated for now, yet already anticipating the next hunt. Keyes handled the scene with his usual meticulous care, erasing any trace that could link him to the crime. The victim's body, now just an empty shell, was disposed of methodically. Perhaps in a remote location, he had pre-selected one of his many secret caches. As he melted back into the night, the world unaware of the horror just committed. Everything continued as normal, but something had changed forever. An indelible stain had marked his soul, if he still had one. The theoretical predator, who had tested boundaries with escalating crimes, had now become a terrifying reality. In the days that followed, Keyes observed the world's reaction, the news of a missing person, the police search, the victim's family's grief with cold detachment. He felt nothing, no gloating, no fear, no guilt, only emptiness, and the realization that even murder couldn't fully fill the bottomless void in his soul. But it had granted a new kind of power, a supreme control he had never experienced before. This first murder was a pivotal milestone. It shattered any remaining barriers, flinging open the door to more violent, more ruthless acts. It confirmed to Keyes that he could do it and get away with it. The randomness, the meticulous preparation, and the absolute indifference became lethal tools in his hands, The darkness was no longer just a part of him, it was him, and he was ready to cast that shadow over anyone, anywhere, at his twisted whim. The blood on the snow was only the beginning. More blood would flow, more tears would fall, more horrors would unfold. His final confession was just beginning to be written in blood. After the blood was spilled, after the final line was erased in the white snow, Israel Keyes didn't transform into a roaring, easily recognizable monster. Instead, the darkness within him didn't consume his outward appearance. On the contrary, his mask of normalcy was crafted and refined with even greater precision, becoming a masterpiece of deception, a perfect shield concealing the horrific abyss in his soul. To the world, he was just a man perhaps a bit quiet, a bit reserved, but nothing to suspect. A father, a construction contractor, a specter living among us. His darkest secrets buried deeper than any body he ever hid. As a father, Keyes could display gestures that outsiders might see as devoted. He had a daughter, and in the rare moments captured or recounted, he could appear caring, engaging in family activities. But behind the smiles, behind those seemingly normal acts, lay a chilling void: love, genuine connection. The authentic emotions of fatherhood, these were foreign to him, or if present, merely roles performed with mechanical calculation. He might teach his daughter survival skills in the wilderness, lessons drawn from his own childhood, but the motive likely wasn't her future well-being. It was a warped reflection of his own predatory instincts, his need for control. Unknowingly, his child lived alongside a monster, sharing meals in a home, oblivious to the nightmares her father unleashed on the world. As a contractor, Keyes presented another image: diligent, reliable, competent. He ran his business with the same meticulous efficiency he applied to his crimes. Clients saw a professional who met deadlines and paid attention to detail. None could suspect that his work trips, his familiar tools, his knowledge of remote sites and structures were perfect enablers of his double life. His truck, laden with construction equipment, could also carry tools of murder, kits for disposal prepared in advance. The structures he built with honest labor stood in grotesque contrast to the secret graves he dug with those same hands, in desolate, isolated places. Maintaining this perfect mask required iron discipline and an astonishing ability to compartmentalize. Keyes lived in a state of absolute separation. The world of his crimes plans, abductions, murders, thefts was kept entirely distinct from his normal life. There was no overlap, no leakage. He could commit an unimaginable atrocity and, hours later, calmly dine with his family or discuss a project with a client, showing no trace of guilt or psychological unrest. His indifference extended beyond his victims to those closest to him, whom he deceived daily. His soul was a landscape of deceit. Every word, every gesture in his daily life could be part of the performance. He was a master actor, and his stage was life itself. His existence mocked notions of trust and authenticity. He moved among us like a phantom, a forgettable face in the crowd, a neighbor you might nod to each morning, unaware you were facing pure evil incarnate. This fabricated normalcy made his crimes all the more terrifying. He wasn't a grotesque monster visible from afar. He was horror cloaked in familiarity. The secrets Keyes carried were heavy, yet they were the source of his perverse strength. Each undetected crime, each carefully hidden body, each successful plan reinforced his sense of superiority. His belief that he stood above the law and human morality. Those secrets were locked deep in his mind, guarded by a fortress of silence and cold calculation. They were deeper than the graves he dug. For while those graves, however hard to find, were tangible, the secrets in his soul were invisible, untouchable, known only to him. One might wonder if a crack ever appeared in that mask, a moment of carelessness, a slip of the tongue, an unusual expression. But Keyes was too meticulous, too controlled. He was a master hunter, not just of victims, but of any sign that could betray his true nature. He lived in a state of constant vigilance, analyzing every situation, every interaction, to ensure his perfect facade remained unshaken. A perfect mask, a deceitful soul that was the essence of Israel Keyes in the years he roamed free, sowing his crimes, a chilling contrast between the false light of his everyday life and the dense darkness of his inhuman acts. He was living proof that evil could lurk in the most unexpected places, behind smiles and seemingly harmless words. And while the world spun on, oblivious, the monster continued his double life, his secrets piling higher, deeper, and darker in the chillingly calculated series of crimes committed by Israel Keyes, executed with near absolute control. There were moments where the brutal randomness of life, or perhaps the slightest miscalculation on his part, created ripples of disruption. The abduction and murder of Samantha Koenig in Anchorage, Alaska, in February 2012, was one such ripple. It wasn't just another crime in his long, dark list. It became an invisible burden, a potential turning point where the walls of the sinister world he had meticulously built began to tremble, whether he immediately recognized it or not. Samantha Koenig, an 18-year-old working at a small roadside coffee stand, was a target Keyes observed, as he had done with others, but something about this case was different. Perhaps it was the public nature of the location, or the audacity of the abduction carried out at her workplace, albeit late at night. Or perhaps it was simply fate. He approached her, subdued her, and took her away, a brutal act familiar to him, yet one that carried the seeds of his downfall. What made the Koenig case stand out was not just the crime itself, but what followed. Keyes kept Samantha bound in a shed near his home for hours before killing her. He then left Alaska for a pre-planned cruise, leaving her body in the shed, an act of reckless confidence in his ability to control the situation, even in his absence. Upon returning, he performed a gruesome and perverse act. He applied makeup to Samantha's corpse, sewed her eyes open, posed her with a recent newspaper, and took a photo to send as a ransom demand to her family, creating the illusion she was still alive. This calculated move was meant to extort money, but also served as a taunting mockery of the family's pain and the authorities' helplessness. However, this ransom demand and his subsequent use of Samantha's debit card planted the seeds of his exposure. Each transaction, each withdrawal, no matter how small, left an electronic trail, an invisible thread tying him to the crime. Keyes, who prided himself on his obsessive caution and ability to erase traces, had made a fundamental error, or perhaps his confidence had morphed into blind arrogance. The burden of the Koenig case wasn't just the risk of detection. There was something else, an intangible weight. Perhaps it was the prolonged relationship with the victim, even after her death. Keeping her body, interacting with it in such a macabre way, may have stirred something in his seemingly hardened soul, not remorse, but perhaps a vague unease, a realization that this time something had slipped beyond his complete control. The walls of his dark world began to tremble, not literally, but in the shaking of his illusion of invincibility. He continued his double life, maintaining his perfect mask, yet, in quiet moments alone with his thoughts, the image of Samantha Koenig, her lifeless eyes in the ransom photo, might have haunted him, not as a specter seeking justice, but as a reminder of the fragility of his plans, of the possibility of error. If there was panic, it wasn't frenzied or uncontrolled. It was a subtle anxiety, a heightened vigilance. He likely reviewed his steps, searching for potential flaws. He may have grown more cautious in subsequent actions, or, conversely, acted more impulsively to reclaim that sense of control. The Koenig case, with all its brutality and perverse calculation, became a focal point in Keyes' criminal profile. It drew media attention, public outcry, and, crucially, the focus of law enforcement. Samantha Koenig's name became a symbol of pain and loss, and, unwittingly, a beacon guiding those hunting the perpetrator. This invisible burden, no matter how much Keyes tried to ignore or suppress it, lingered. It was like a small crack in a massive dam, initially insignificant, but with water seeping through, growing stronger, threatening to break the entire structure. The walls of secrecy and absolute control were no longer as solid. They trembled under the weight of a specific crime, a specific victim, and the specific mistakes that even a killer as cunning as Keyes couldn't evade forever. The light of justice, though faint and distant, began to flicker, shining directly on the cracks in Israel Keyes' dark fortress. After the Koenig case, as the walls of his dark world began to tremble, a new, chilling sensation crept into Israel Keyes' mind. It wasn't merely the mundane fear of capture or legal punishment. He had always accounted for that, with contingency plans, however delusional. To counter it, no, this was something else, more elusive, yet more terrifying in its own way. A cold, growing conviction that he wasn't just being watched by the law. Something else, an invisible presence, a silent witness to his darkest deeds, committed in absolute secrecy, seemed to linger in the silence of long nights, alone with his twisted plans or memories of his victims. Whispers began to emerge. They weren't literal sounds, not voices of the living or the dead. They were ripples in the stillness, inexplicable feelings of unease, a shadow flickering at the edge of his vision when no one was there, a chill running down his spine without cause. Strange, fragmented dreams filled with distorted images of his crimes, yet always with a watching presence, unjudging but unignorable, lurking in the chaotic scenes. Keyes, a man of cold logic and pragmatic calculation, tried to dismiss these sensations. He told himself they were stress, the byproduct of constant vigilance, the toll of a life without a moment's true peace. He, who had long abandoned all spiritual beliefs, couldn't possibly entertain notions of ghosts or supernatural forces. Yet this cold conviction wasn't easily dispelled. It clung to him like damp fog, seeping into every corner of his mind. He began to feel watched, not by security cameras or nosy neighbors, but by something undefined. In the forests, once his safest haven where he committed his most horrific acts, there now seemed to be another presence. The wind through the trees was no longer nature's whisper, but the sigh of an invisible witness. The silence of his secret graves was no longer one of oblivion, but of mute accusation. This belief didn't stop him. If anything, it may have driven him to act more recklessly, as if to challenge it, to prove he was unafraid, still in control. But each new crime only intensified the sense of being watched, making it sharper, more palpable. The invisible shadow grew larger, closer. He started noticing things he might have previously ignored. A bird darting past a window, a door catching unexpectedly. Random coincidences that, in his unsettled state, seemed to carry meaning. A sign of something. Keyes, who prided himself on his rationality, began searching for patterns in the chaos, messages in the random, as if to understand the entity observing him. The most terrifying aspect wasn't a tangible enemy, but the ambiguity of this shadow. It had no form, no voice, no clear motive. It simply was. Watching, recording. It didn't threaten or attack, yet its presence was more frightening than any direct danger. It was a constant reminder that his crimes weren't entirely secret, that something beyond his control existed, something he couldn't calculate, deceive, or destroy. This belief, irrational as it was for someone like Keyes, held its own logic in his warped inner world. He had placed himself in the role of God, deciding life and death. So, was there another God, a higher power? Observing this self-appointed deity, he had scorned all moral codes, all human limits. Could there be a cosmic law, invisible and inescapable, beginning to stir? If only in his perception. The whispers in the silence grew louder. They were no longer mere ripples, but took shape as obsessive thoughts. He wasn't alone in his crimes, even without a human witness. There was another, a piercing gaze that couldn't be fooled, and this belief, however much he tried to deny it, planted a new kind of fear in him, not of prison or human punishment, but a metaphysical dread, a fear of an inevitable, ultimate judgment. This shadow in his mind wasn't born of remorse or a guilty conscience. Those had died long ago. It was the response of a mind that had ventured too far into darkness, beginning to see shapes within it, entities born of its own emptiness and sin. He was not alone. And this realization, however vague and terrifying, was one of the first, albeit unwilling, steps toward an inevitable confrontation, not just with earthly justice, but with the very darkness he had nurtured. The net of justice is vast and fine, and though it may seem sparse, escape is nearly impossible. For Israel Keyes, who moved like a phantom across states, sowing crimes and erasing traces with methodical precision. That net seemed invisible, easily pierced. He was too confident in his intelligence, his caution, his control, but every action, however small, in today's interconnected world, can leave a fragile trace. And it was those seemingly harmless traces from the Samantha Koenig case, her debit card transactions, that slowly tightened the noose around him. On March 13, 2012, at a gas station in Lufkin, Texas, thousands of miles from Anchorage, Alaska, Keyes' perfect mask was finally torn away. There was no dramatic shootout, no breathless chase, only police cars quietly closing in, cold flashing lights in the night, and the firm voices of law enforcement in that moment. The world Keyes had built on deception and control began to crumble like a sandcastle before the tide. Shock, perhaps, was the first emotion, though he had always prepared for the possibility of capture. When it happened in an unfamiliar place, due to a seemingly trivial mistake, it must have been jarring. His meticulous plans, his confidence in limitless evasion, all became meaningless in an instant. He, the predator, the one always in control, had become the prey, caught. But as the cold handcuffs tightened around his wrists, as he was led to the police car, a stranger, more terrifying sensation crept in, overshadowing even the fear of earthly justice. It was the shadow. The invisible shadow he had sensed watching him became denser, more tangible in the moment of his capture. It wasn't the police car lights or the silhouettes of those around him. It was an internal shadow, a spectral presence only he could feel, and it seemed to revel or perhaps merely observe his downfall with a chilling calm. The glare of headlights, the unfamiliar faces of officers, the crackle of radios, all the mundane details of an arrest. But to Keyes, they paled against the shadow lengthening in his mind. The fear of prison, years of confinement, the loss of freedom, these were real. But they couldn't compare to the metaphysical dread that shadow evoked. It wasn't bound by prison walls, couldn't be handcuffed, couldn't be interrogated. It was there, in his head, an eternal witness to his indelible crimes. In the days and weeks that followed, as he was held and questioned, Keyes tried to maintain control. He played cat and mouse with investigators, doling out information sparingly, using his secrets as bargaining chips. He appeared cold, calculated, remorseless. But that was only the surface. The real battle wasn't with the FBI or prosecutors. It was with the shadow in the night, growing larger, more consuming. The nights in his cell stretched endlessly. The prison's silence didn't bring peace. It amplified the whispers within. The shadow was no longer a vague feeling. It began to take shape, though always shifting, elusive. Sometimes it was distorted images of his victims. Sometimes it was a nameless entity with blazing eyes, piercing the darkness, seeing through his core. He tried to ignore it, to focus on navigating his predicament, but the shadow remained, an unwelcome companion, a constant reminder of an inevitable reckoning. The fear of earthly justice, though real, had limits: a life sentence, perhaps death row. But this shadow promised a different punishment, an eternal torment beyond human endurance. It cared nothing for confessions or deals with investigators. It cared only for the truth of what he had done, and it would never let him forget. As details of Keyes' crimes emerged, as the public learned of his calculated brutality, he was seen as a remorseless monster. Few knew that within this monster, a different fear, a metaphysical horror, was growing. The law's net had ensnared him, and he was caught. But another net, invisible and far more terrifying, was tightening around him, and the shadow in the night was its keeper. His capture wasn't the end, but the beginning of a new confrontation, not just with earthly justice, but with the very demons he had unleashed, both in the world and within his own soul. The trial, meant to be the pinnacle of the criminal justice process, where truth is laid bare under the light of the law, held a different meaning for Israel Keyes. It wasn't just a confrontation with prosecutors, irrefutable evidence, or the prospect of the harshest sentence. No, for him, each day in the courtroom, each glance from the victims' families, each piece of testimony, felt less like a standard legal proceeding and more like a grim spiritual ritual of judgment, a public drama where he was not merely a defendant, but a soul being weighed before an invisible force. The shadow he had sensed, the one that watched him, now seemed more present than ever in the tense air of the courtroom. It didn't occupy a specific seat or appear to anyone but him. Yet he felt its weight, its silent judgment, the cold fluorescent lights, the formal attire of lawyers and judges, the sharp rap of the gavel. All these mundane elements seemed a mere veneer for a deeper reality, a parallel judgment unfolding. As details of his crimes were presented, evidence, images, witness accounts, they weren't just dry facts. To Keyes, they were daggers twisting into an invisible wound carved by that shadow in his soul. Each description of a victim's pain, of his brutality, not only stirred outrage among those present, but seemed to elicit a nod of agreement from the shadow within, as if saying, "See, this is what you've done. Nothing can be hidden." He maintained his cold, defiant exterior, occasionally dangling information about other victims to manipulate, to cling to some semblance of power. But inside, an erosion was underway. His confidence in his intelligence and control had been shaken since his arrest. Now, facing the weight of evidence and the trial's pressure, the cracks in his psychological fortress widened. The eyes of the victims' families, filled with pain, rage, and a desperate search for answers, pierced him like needles. He might not show emotion, but he couldn't escape the weight of their gazes. They weren't just individuals staring at him. They were embodiments of the suffering he caused, accusations needing no voice, and the shadow within seemed to conspire with those looks, amplifying them, turning them into searing flames. The legal proceedings, lawyers' arguments, the judge's rulings followed their course, but to Keyes, they were mere accessories to a grander drama, one with a predetermined end, not by human law, but by some spiritual law he couldn't comprehend, yet couldn't deny. He felt like a puppet, pulled by the strings of his own sins. The trial merely the final stage to expose his inner decay. Even though he wasn't formally tried for all the murders he confessed to having taken his own life, before many cases could be fully prosecuted, the hearings, public interrogations, and leaked details to the media fueled this sense of public judgment. Every headline, every news broadcast, felt like a verdict not just from society, but from that invisible force he increasingly believed was real. This spiritual ritual of judgment offered no purification or chance for redemption. It only brought a raw exposure of evil and confirmation of something beyond his control, something his intelligence or brutality couldn't defeat if he once saw himself as a god. Now he felt judged by a true god, or at least a representative of one, and the judgment was merciless. Each day's end, returning to his cell, brought not just physical exhaustion, but spiritual depletion. After hours facing his crimes, laid bare before the world and, more crucially, before the relentless shadow in his mind, the cell's silence was no longer a place for scheming or smugness. It became a space where the shadow ran rampant, where silent accusations echoed endlessly. The trial, though perhaps incomplete in a legal sense for all his crimes, fulfilled its role in Keyes's mind as a ritual of exposure, of accusation, of foreshadowing an inevitable end. Human justice might have limits and complexities, but the judgment he felt from the shadow was direct, ruthless. With no room for defense or appeal, he had sown the wind, and now he was reaping the whirlwind not just from the law, but from deeper, more mysterious forces his own actions had awakened. After months facing the public, the evidence, the anguished eyes of victims' families, and, most crucially, the ever-growing shadow of judgment in his mind. The prison door slammed shut behind Israel Keyes with a cold finality. No more endless interrogations. No more tense hearings. Only 4 gray concrete walls, a creaking iron cot, and a silence so absolute it was unlike the wild forests he once claimed as his domain. This concrete tomb, confining his body, also imprisoned his soul, and the only sound left was the mute echo of his indelible crimes. Keyes' world shrank abruptly, brutally, from a predator roaming freely across the country, sowing terror at will. He was now confined to a cramped space, every movement monitored, every privilege stripped away. Control, the thing he craved and prided himself on, now rested in others' hands. He, the hunter, was now a caged animal, awaiting his final fate. The prison's silence wasn't tranquil or serene. It was heavy, oppressive, like the air before a great storm. Far from muffling sounds, it amplified the smallest noises within his mind, the silent screams of victims, the howl of wind over secret graves, the drip of blood on snow. All the sounds he had tried to bury now echoed clearer than ever in this imposed stillness. The only external sounds breaking this silence were the metallic clank of bars, the steady footsteps of guards, the indifferent opening and closing of cell doors. These didn't offer connection, but underscored his isolation, his captivity. They were constant reminders of his prisoner status, his powerlessness. Yet, more terrifying than the concrete walls or cold bars was the internal silence, the shadow he had sensed, no longer distracted by the trial's events or confrontations with investigators. Now had free rein in the cell's confined, quiet space. It was no longer a vague feeling or faint whisper. It became a constant presence, an invisible cellmate, relentlessly reminding him of what he had done, the lives he had taken, the pain he had caused. There were no more intricate plans to devise, no targets to stalk, no escapes to execute. His restless mind, once ceaselessly active, had no outlet. It was forced to confront itself, its dark memories, the demons he had nurtured. The prison's silence became a vast mirror, reflecting his rot and sin without concealment or mercy. The days dragged on, slow and monotonous, each identical to the last. Sunlight, if it reached him, was just a faint streak through a small window, too weak to dispel the inner darkness. He might try reading or exercising in his cramped space, but these were feeble attempts to distract from the internal torment. For when night fell, when the silence deepened, the shadow returned, stronger, more haunting. The mute echo of his crimes wasn't just images or sounds, it was a feeling of guilt. One Keyes had suppressed and denied for years, now creeping back, however faintly and distorted. Not true remorse, not empathy for his victims, but perhaps a recognition of his own failure, of the endless void even his most horrific crimes couldn't fill. Or maybe it was fear of a punishment greater than death, an eternal judgment the shadow seemed to promise. The concrete tomb didn't just confine his body, it was slowly strangling his soul, or what remained of it. The silence wasn't empty, it was filled with the ghosts of his past, with unspoken accusations. In that silence, a process was unfolding, a final confrontation not with the law, but with himself, with the evil he had become. The clang of steel, the guard's footsteps. These were the sounds of the outside world, but the deafening roar came from within, from the mute echoes of a life wholly consumed by darkness. Amid the gray concrete walls and the heavy silence of the prison, where Israel Keyes' darkness seemed to condense, a faint spark of light unexpectedly flickered. It wasn't a blazing sun or a sudden epiphany. It was fragile, almost imperceptible, but in a space utterly devoid of hope. Even a tiny flame could draw attention. This spark came in an unexpected form, a connection, a voice, a presence that pierced the icy shell Keyes had so carefully constructed, opening a narrow path where none had existed before. Perhaps it was an old pastor, visiting prisoners regularly, not with judgment or condemnation, but with a quiet calm and a ready ear. His warm voice, free of the dogmatic sermons Keyes once scorned, carried simple stories of compassion, forgiveness, and the possibility of finding light in the deepest darkness. At first, Keyes might have mocked, dismissed, or met him with defiant silence. But the pastor's persistent, non-judgmental presence, the absence of condemnation in his eyes, may have slowly eroded Keyes' defenses. Or perhaps the spark came from an unlikely cellmate, someone burdened by their own sins and pain, yet who had found a different path, a belief to cling to. It could have been casual conversations through the bars, fragmented exchanges during rare breaks, a story of regret, an unexpected act of kindness, a look of understanding instead of contempt. For someone like Keyes, accustomed to isolation and confrontation, such small gestures could make an unforeseen difference. It might even have been a letter, penned by a stranger who read of his crimes, but instead of curses, wrote of their own pain, the complexity of human nature, and a fragile hope for redemption, even for the most lost. Or perhaps it was an old, dog-eared book left behind, its yellowed pages filled with philosophies of repentance and the meaning of existence ideas Keyes had never bothered to consider. Whatever its form, this lone spark touched something deep within Keyes, a place he thought long dead. It didn't banish the darkness or bring instant peace, but it caused a stir, a question, for the first time in years. He glimpsed another possibility beyond emptiness and despair. This encounter, whether with a person, a letter, or an idea, was no miracle. It was merely a tiny seed planted in the barren soil of his soul. Whether it would take root depended on many factors, but its mere existence, however fragile, was a marvel in Keyes's circumstances. It showed that even in the darkest places, even in the most brutal souls, a faint possibility for change, for a different perspective, could exist. The shadow in Keyes's mind remained, powerful and haunting. But now, something else, however small, vied for space. A question, a curiosity, a nameless feeling. Could there truly be such a thing as grace? Was peace possible? Even after unforgivable crimes, questions he once would have dismissed with contempt now lingered, like moths drawn to a distant flame. This lone spark wasn't salvation. It was only an invitation. A door hesitantly cracked open. It promised no forgiveness from the outside world or erasure of his crimes, but it could be the start of a different inner journey, one confronting not just what he had done, but who he had become, and perhaps, in a fleeting moment, who he might yearn to be. In the prison's dense darkness, where isolation and despair reigned, this unexpected spark, whether a pastor, a cellmate, or a letter, offered a new possibility, a chance that, even with his body confined, his soul might find a narrow, rugged path towards something beyond the abyss. It was an unearned grace, an undeserved gift, yet one with the latent power to alter the final trajectory of a soul that had strayed too far. The lone spark, though fragile, began to erode the icy layers encasing Israel Keyes's soul. It wasn't a blazing torch lighting the way, but a faint candle flickering in the long night, enough for him to dimly glimpse the shapes within his own darkness. The prison's silence, once amplifying the roars of his crimes, now occasionally became a space for reluctant reflection. This wasn't self-justification or pity, but a raw confrontation with his entire memory, from childhood to his final barbaric acts. This wasn't a confession to investigators for leniency. Those confessions were calculated, doled out sparingly, with Keyes holding back his final secrets like trump cards. This confession unfolded in silence, in the solitude of his cell, before a sole judge himself, and perhaps the invisible shadow he sensed, which now seemed not only to judge but to await acknowledgement. He began to piece together his fractured life, not as random events, but as a path to the abyss, where each choice, conscious or not, led him deeper. His isolated childhood, harsh dogmas, the collapse of faith, these were no longer excuses, but fragments of a larger portrait, one depicting the creation of a monster. He saw the boy Israel, solitary and observant, absorbing the darkness of a fractured world, and for the first time, perhaps, felt a faint pang not for his current self, but for the child he once was, deprived of love and given too little care. Memories of his first crimes, the thrill and power, resurfaced not just with perverse satisfaction, but with a terrifying emptiness. He realized each boundary crossed didn't bring him closer to true freedom or control, but dug a deeper pit of despair in his soul. The escalation of his crimes from theft and arson to abduction and murder wasn't a display of strength, but a growing loss of control over his addiction to violence and destruction. The faces of his victims, once mere anonymous targets, numbers on his dark list, now appeared more vividly: Samantha Koenig, Bill and Lorraine Currier, and others he confessed to or kept secret. He couldn't feel their pain as a normal person might. His empathy had been eroded nearly to nothing, but he began to grasp the scale of destruction he caused. Not just the deaths, but the shattered families and lingering agony of those left behind. This confession wasn't just recounting his deeds. More crucially, it was a belated, distorted attempt to understand why the darkness grew to consume him entirely. He saw his arrogance, his contempt for human life, his hubris in his own intelligence. He saw a man who claimed godlike power, only to become a slave to his darkest desires, in the cell's silence, facing a dim reflection on the concrete wall. He didn't just see the serial killer Israel Keyes, he saw the broken child within, unloved, misguided, who chose a wrong path long ago. This wasn't about blaming circumstances, but acknowledging the complexity of his being a mix of victim and perpetrator, darkness and a faint spark of belated awareness. This reflection was painful, demanding he strip away the armor of indifference and pride to face the raw truth of himself. At times, he wanted to retreat, to sink back into denial and contempt, but the spark, however faint, persisted, and the judging shadow remained, refusing to let him evade forever. This confession was unwritten, unspoken to anyone. It was an internal dialogue, a wrestle with his own demons, yet it was a vital step, for any form of redemption, even in thought, requires complete acknowledgement of guilt. And Israel Keyes, in his final days, confined in a concrete tomb, began that agonizing process, reviewing his entire memory and confessing not to the law, but to the long dormant conscience within him. After long days immersed in painful reflection, peeling away layers of hubris and indifference to face the raw truth of his horrific crimes, Israel Keyes stood at a new threshold, one he never imagined approaching. It wasn't a door to physical freedom or forgiveness from the outside world. It was a deep inner space, where emptiness and despair had reigned too long, now showing faint cracks, revealing a vague, unnamed yearning. The judging shadow in his mind, having witnessed his silent acknowledgement of guilt, seemed to undergo a subtle shift. It was no longer just a relentless accuser, but carried an air of expectation, as if urging him toward one final step, and the lone spark, whether from the pastor, the cellmate, or the anonymous letter, had planted a notion, a possibility prayer. For Keyes, who had abandoned faith in his youth and scorned all religion, the idea of prayer initially seemed absurd, weak, even hypocritical. He had lived defying all rules, all authority, even that of a god. If one existed, so why now, when all was lost, when he had nothing left to lose, would he lower himself to plead? Yet the urge didn't come from reason, but from a deeper place, where pain and solitude had worn down all resistance. It wasn't a strategy for salvation or escape from punishment. It was like the final breath of a drowning man, an instinctive, desperate reach for something, anything that might offer a fleeting moment of peace. For the first time, perhaps, Israel Keyes truly prayed, not the rote prayers of his childhood, nor bargains or pleas for rescue. This was a different prayer, a broken one, rising from a crushed soul. He didn't kneel or clasp his hands in ritual. He might have sat on his cold iron cot or stood gazing through the cell's tiny window. His prayer had no specific recipient. He didn't name a deity. Perhaps he whispered to the void, to the prison's silence, to the shadow in his mind, or to the fragile spark he had felt. The prayer's content was unclear, perhaps wordless, a sigh, a groan from his soul's depths, or maybe a chaotic outpouring of emotions, belated regret, anguish over his own emptiness, exhaustion from a life of violence and deceit. Please, end it. Perhaps those were the only words that took shape. End the torment, end the silent screams, end the relentless shadow, end this meaningless existence. This wasn't a plea for life or forgiveness, but for release, in some form, stripped of his arrogant persona, the cold killer's facade. He laid bare his weakness, his brokenness, his despair before a force he couldn't define. In that moment, the shadow in his mind seemed to soften slightly. Its harsh judgment gave way to a waiting silence, and the fragile spark, still faint, felt a touch warmer. This prayer didn't work miracles. The prison walls didn't crumble. His victims didn't return. His crimes weren't erased. But something shifted within him, a surrender, an acceptance. He had touched the depths of despair, and from there, A faint hope not for a better future, but for a more peaceful end, began to flicker. This wasn't redemption in a traditional religious sense. It was a moment of absolute truth, where Keyes, who had lived a life of lies, was finally honest with himself, his pain, and his yearning for peace. Prayer doesn't change God, it changes the one who prays. For Keyes, this broken prayer, whispered to the void, was perhaps the first and final step on a path to an end solitary, yet not entirely devoid of a faint glow of peace. It was his final confession, not in words, but in a shattered heart's cry, directed to an undefined realm. After that broken prayer, a strange new stillness enveloped the cramped confines of the cell. It wasn't the heavy silence of torment, but a near serene quiet, like a lake after a storm, with faint ripples lingering but no longer raging, the chaotic tempest within Israel Keyes, which had roared for so many years, finally began to subside. The judging shadow seemed to recede, or perhaps it merged into the stillness, no longer a distinct, threatening entity. The whispers, the haunting images, faded like candles burning low, flickering weakly before extinguishing. What remained was an emptiness, not the desolate void of despair, but a purified emptiness, like a page wiped clean, though still bearing faint traces of ink. Days passed, slow and almost imperceptible. He no longer wrestled with the demons in his mind. There were no more plans, no more defiance, only awaiting, free of fear or impatience. His breaths grew lighter, more even. The faint light from the small window ceased to mock him, becoming a gentle reminder of a world outside, one he no longer belonged to, but no longer hated or sought to conquer. Then, one day, in the absolute solitude of the cell, Israel Keyes' final breath slipped away. No struggle, no cry, just a final release, a return to dust. His eyes, once glinting with cold calculation, closed, perhaps finding, for the first time, a trace of peace. Death came not as a violent punishment, but as a quiet, ambiguous liberation. No triumph, no terror, only darkness. Then stillness, a final stillness, enveloping all.